January 30th, 1944, Anzio beachhead, Italy. The pencil shook in Headman Vera Hoffman's fingers as he leaned against the concrete wall of his command bunker, jotting down what he had just seen through the observation periscope. The Americans wielded artillery of previously unimagined destructive force. Bunker Louisa was simply gone. 4 feet of reinforced concrete vanished in an instant. Through the haze of smoke and dust, he could make out the crater where the fortification had stood for 8 months. The bunker, built by Wehrmacht engineers to resist direct hits from 210mm shells, had been erased by a single shot from an American super-heavy piece firing from well beyond visual range. 32 men of the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division disappeared along with tons of concrete and rebar. The culprit was the M1 240mm Howitzer, making its combat debut with the 697th Field Artillery Battalion. What Hoffman and thousands of other German troops would learn in the months that followed was that long-held assumptions about fortification warfare were now obsolete. The U.S. Army had introduced a weapon able to turn the toughest bunker into a tomb with chilling precision. The M1 240 Minim traced its origins to a 1940 U.S. Army ordnance study that reached a blunt verdict. Existing American artillery could not defeat modern European fortifications. The biggest gun then in service, the 155mm long Tom, could inflict damage, but could not reliably demolish the reinforced concrete bunkers that had become central to German defensive doctrine. The specifications for a new weapon seemed almost impossible. A mobile system able to send a 360-pound projectile more than 14 miles with enough accuracy to strike individual bunkers and penetrate 6 feet of reinforced concrete, yet transportable by standard military vehicles. Unlike the colossal railway guns of the previous war, the answer that came out of Watervliet Arsenal in New York was an engineering marvel. In firing position, the M1 tipped the scales at 64,700 pounds, needed a crew of 14, and could manage a round every 3 minutes under ideal conditions. Its barrel alone weighed 23,000 pounds and stretched 35 feet, moved on a specialized 6-wheeled wagon. Emplacement took about 8 hours on average, including digging a recoil pit and assembling the weapon with the M2 crane that accompanied each unit. Production began in November 1942 with 6 pilot models. By 1944, Watervliet had reached a pace of about 13 guns per month and ultimately built 315 pieces before production ended in August 1945. Each gun cost roughly $380,000, equivalent to about a dozen Sherman tanks, but their strategic worth proved priceless. The 697th and 698th Field Artillery Battalions reached the Anzio beachhead in January 1944, bringing the 1st M1 240mm howitzers to combat. The German 14th Panzer Corps had turned the hills around the beachhead into a layered fortress, with interlocking bunkers covering every approach to the Allied lines. At 14:30 on January 30th, 1944, the 697th fired the first 240mm combat round, aiming at a German observation post on the Alban Hills. The shell traveled 23,000 yards, about 13 miles, and scored a direct hit. The bunker, its observation gear, and crew ceased to exist. Major Herman E. Smith, commander of the 697th, recorded the psychological effect in the unit history. After our first day of firing, German prisoners described total demoralization in their units. They called them earthquake shells that made the ground tremble for hundreds of meters. Many refused to occupy bunkers after seeing our strikes. The destruction at Anzio was measured precisely. Rounds fired, 2,847. Bunkers engaged, 67. Bunkers destroyed, 61. Average rounds per bunker, 4.8. Maximum range achieved 25,100 yards. The war diary of the German 715th Infantry Division, captured after Rome's liberation, lamented that American super-heavy artillery made fortified positions untenable and that losses from single shells exceeded those from prolonged conventional bombardments. The breakthrough at Monte Cassino in May 1944 further proved the 240mm howitzer's ability to shatter the staunchest defenses. The Gustav Line had resisted months of Allied attacks centered on the ancient monastery that German paratroopers had converted into a fortress. The 240th Field Artillery Battalion, equipped with 8 M1 howitzers, joined Operation Diadem on May 11, 1944. From positions near Mayano, they could reach every German emplacement along the Gustav Line, chiefly the reinforced bunkers cut into the mountainside below the monastery. British Major General Francis Tucker, whose 4th Indian Division had suffered grievously in earlier assaults, observed the bombardment and reported that the American super-heavy guns accomplished what months of bombing and ordinary artillery had failed to do. Each successful strike obliterated a German strongpoint. The psychological blow to the defenders was decisive. They realized there was nowhere safe. The 240mm howitzers fired continuously for 72 hours during the breakthrough, expending 1,147 rounds. Post-battle analysis showed that of 43 major German bunkers targeted, 39 were completely destroyed, and the remaining 4 had been abandoned by their crews after near misses. The 240mm's effectiveness came not only from its heavy shell but from the American fire control system as a whole. The Fire Direction Center, FDC concept, refined through 3 years of combat, made accuracy and coordination unprecedented. Forward observers armed with SCR-610 radios could call in fire from positions miles away. Their target coordinates were sent to the FDC, where trained crews used graphical firing tables, slide rules, and meteorological data to calculate firing solutions. Within 4 minutes of a call for fire, rounds could be striking targets more than 14 miles distant. The time-on-target technique amplified the psychological effect. Multiple batteries firing from different locations at staggered times could have their shells arrive on target simultaneously. A German bunker might be struck by 6 240mm rounds within a 2-second window, over a ton of high explosive arriving without warning. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas B. Hedekin, commander of the 245th Field Artillery Battalion, wrote in 1944, "We don't fire barrages. We carry out surgical strikes. A forward observer pinpoints a specific bunker, we compute the solution, and we drop 1 or 2 rounds right on it. The precision terrifies the Germans more than volume." 4 M1 240mm howitzers attached to 99th Corps took part in Operation Cobra, the July 1944 breakout from the Normandy beachhead. The German 352nd Infantry Division had fortified every hedge and crossroads around St. Lo, creating a defensive labyrinth that had stalled the Allied advance for weeks. The 272nd Field Artillery Battalion brought its 240mm howitzers to bear on July 24th, systematically demolishing German strongpoints that had survived massive carpet bombing. Hill 122, the key terrain dominating St. Lo, had been hardened with concrete bunkers built into reverse slopes, positions thought safe from air attack. Technical Sergeant Raymond Jones, Section Chief with Battery A, 272nd Field Artillery, later testified that the Germans believed those reverse slope positions were secure, until our observer called in the coordinates. We fired 3 rounds to effect. When the smoke lifted, there remained only a gouge in the hillside where the bunker had stood. The morale effect was instantaneous. The German 3rd Parachute Division, elite troops who had bled at Cassino, began deserting prepared positions rather than endure 240mm bombardment. Their commander, General Richard Schey, was captured on July 31st and told his interrogators, "Your super-heavy artillery made static defense impossible." My men, veterans who had never fallen back, fled their bunkers. The assault on the Gothic Line in northern Italy during the autumn of 1944 underscored the 240mm howitzers' worth in mountain fighting. German engineers had spent a year hewing fortifications into the Apennine ridges, using the terrain to create positions deemed impervious to artillery. The 697th Field Artillery Battalion, hardened by Anzio and the push on Rome, emplaced their howitzers in the valleys beneath. The Gothic Line in September 1944, by employing high-angle fire, they could send shells almost straight down onto German emplacements built into reverse slopes. The destruction at the Futa Pass illustrated the weapon's capabilities. The pass, which controlled the principal route to Bologna, was defended by elaborate bunker complexes constructed by Organization Taut. On September 16, 1944, the 697th began a methodical bombardment of those works. Private First Class Donald Matthews, an ammunition handler with the 697th, wrote home that the shells climbed so high they vanished into the clouds before coming straight down onto the German bunkers, and that the explosions shook the whole mountain. After a bunker was hit, there was nothing left but a crater. The Fuda Pass fell in 5 days. German casualties from collapsing emplacements outnumbered those from direct fighting. The 4th Parachute Division's war diary recorded that American super-heavy shells penetrated overhead cover once judged sufficient, and that morale was collapsing as troops refused to man fortifications. The systematic reduction of the Siegfried Line beginning in September 1944 represented the 240mm Howitzer's greatest contribution to Allied victory. The West Wall ran 390 miles from the Netherlands to Switzerland and included over 18,000 bunkers, pillboxes, and fortified positions built between 1936 and 1940. The 265th Field Artillery Battalion brought its M1 howitzers to the Siegfried Line near Arkham in September 1944 to face formidable defenses. Type 10 bunkers with 3 to 4 foot walls, command bunkers with 8-foot thick walls, and infantry positions with interlocking fields of fire. The first major test came at the Scharnhorst Line, an extension of the Siegfried defenses around Aachen. On October 8, 1944, the 265th began preparatory fires for the 1st Infantry Division's assault. In 6 hours, they fired 238 rounds and destroyed 19 of 22 targeted bunkers. Corporal Robert Williams, a forward observer with the 16th Infantry Regiment, described the barrage. Each 240mm strike felt like a localized earthquake. Concrete emplacements we had been told would take days to reduce were gone in minutes. The defenders inside never stood a chance. That pattern repeated across the front. The 278th Field Artillery Battalion supporting V Corps demolished 73 bunkers in the Schnee-Eifel region in December 1944. The 698th operating near Metz eliminated the fortress ring around the city in November 1944, firing over 3,000 rounds in 2 weeks. The Vajra Mountains campaign from October to November 1944 posed special problems. German units had hardened the heavily wooded ridges with bunkers concealed beneath dense tree cover, invisible to air reconnaissance and shielded from ordinary artillery by the terrain. The 265th developed new forest fighting techniques. When proximity-fused shells were available, they achieved air bursts above the canopy so blast effects could reach downward onto concealed positions. With conventional projectiles, they used a box-and-one pattern, 4 rounds at the corners of a suspected emplacement and 1 round in the center. Master Sergeant Harold Anderson, Section Chief with the 265th, explained that observation in the forest was difficult, but the 240 meters did not demand pinpoint accuracy. Even near misses induced ground shock that collapsed bunkers. We'd fire, wait for the dust to settle, and the infantry would find nothing but craters and bodies. The liberation of Strasbourg on November 23, 1944, was preceded by 240mm strikes on the outer defenses. The German 553rd Infantry Division abandoned their positions after losing 12 bunkers to 90 minutes of targeted fire. Post-war U.S. Army engineering analysis explained why the 240mm howitzer was so devastating against fortifications. The concrete-piercing shell, designated M17, used a hardened steel cap behind a 360-pound mass traveling at 2,300 FTS, delivering roughly 2.8 million foot-pounds of kinetic energy to an impact area under 20 inches. The resulting pressure over 200,000 psi exceeded the compressive strength of any concrete. Crucially, a delayed fuse permitted penetration of 3 to 6 feet before detonation. The blast inside the concrete mass produced sympathetic fracturing. Shock waves reflecting off steel reinforcement set up complex stresses that shattered entire structures from within. The high-explosive round M114 carried 49 lb of TNT with aluminum powder additives that increased blast effect by about 40% over pure TNT. Fused for surface burst, it could make craters roughly 50 feet wide and 20 feet deep in ordinary soil, or about 30 feet wide and 12 feet deep in rocky ground. Deploying 240mm howitzers demanded extraordinary logistics that highlighted American organizational reach. Each battalion required 50 to 100 shells daily, weighing 18 to 36 tons, along with 2,000 gallons of fuel for prime movers and generators, specialized maintenance gear, and reinforced ammunition carriers. The supply chain stretched from Watervliet Arsenal to the front, sometimes covering 3,000 miles. Each shell needed precision forging of the body, machining to tolerances of 0.01 inch, careful filling with explosive compounds, installation of precision fuses, individual inspection, and proof testing. By March 1945, the U.S. Army had stockpiled over 500 240mm rounds in European depots. Monthly consumption peaked at 35,000 rounds during the Rhine crossings, an industrial throughput Germany, Japan, or even the Soviet Union could not match. The Rhine crossing operations of March 1945 displayed the 240mm Howitzer at its most effective. Operation Plunder, Montgomery's set-piece crossing on March 23-24, was preceded by the largest artillery preparation of the Western War. American Doctrine Corps contributed 12,240mm howitzers to the bombardment. The target was the Wesel fortified zone, where the German 84th Infantry Division had constructed elaborate bunker systems along the east bank. Beginning at 1700 hours on March 23rd, the 240mm guns commenced systematic destruction of identified positions. Captain William Morrison, commanding Battery B of the 278th, recorded that aerial photos showed every bunker and that they worked from north to south, engaging each emplacement with 4 to 6 rounds. By midnight, they had destroyed 31 bunkers and damaged 12 more, clearing the way for the crossing. German survivors reported total demoralization after seeing their fortifications disintegrate. The 84th Division's returns showed 2,400 casualties from artillery alone, most caused by collapsing bunkers. The encirclement of Army Group B in the Ruhr Pocket from April 1 to 18, 1945 saw 240mm howitzers reducing industrial sites converted into fortresses. German units had converted factories into defensive works by reinforcing industrial buildings with concrete, and the 698th Field Artillery Battalion helped reduce the pocket's northern sector. The Krupp Steelworks at Essen, bolstered with extra concrete, was struck on April 9th, and 240mm rounds turned main production halls into twisted rubble. Staff Sergeant James Peterson, a forward observer with the 313th Infantry Regiment, watched in disbelief. These were not ordinary structures, but industrial fortresses with 3-foot-thick walls, and the 240mm projectiles passed through them as if they were paper. The psychological effect on the defenders was decisive. Mass surrenders followed once troops saw what happened to the factory complexes. Army Group B, which had numbered roughly 430,000, capitulated after only 18 days, and intelligence assessments attributed the rapid collapse in part to the systematic neutralization of hardened positions by super-heavy artillery, which convinced many that further resistance was futile. Production of the 240mm howitzer at Watervliet Arsenal embodied American industrial mobilization at its peak. Founded in 1813, the facility became the nation's primary maker of large-caliber guns. The output figures tell the story. 6 pilot pieces in November 1942. 72 units in 1943, about 6 per month, 158 in 1944, roughly 13 per month, and 79 from January to August 1945, about 10 per month, for a total of 315 guns, while the workforce swelled to some 9,100 employees on 3 shifts, 7 days a week, with women performing 35% of the precision machining tasks previously considered beyond female labor. The Arsenal's monthly payroll topped $3 million, making it the district's largest employer. Each barrel required some 65 tons of special steel, 847 separate machining operations, 72 hours of precision boring, heat treatment in furnaces up to 2,500 degrees, and individual proof firing with overpressure charges. Quality control was rigorous. Of 315 guns produced, only 2 failed acceptance tests for minor recoil mechanism faults that were quickly fixed, and no M1240mm howitzer ever suffered a catastrophic failure in combat. American production of 240mm ammunition also bewildered German planners. Watervliet alone turned out roughly 2,000 rounds per month by 1944, and with additional output from Picatinny, Arsenal and civilian contractors' total monthly production reached about 10,000 rounds by early 1945. Each round was a feat of mass production precision. The shell body forged from 4140 chrome molybdenum steel, machined to tolerances of plus 0.01 inch, charged with 49 pounds of grade A TNT, fitted with precision-turned rotating bands and individually gauged and inspected. The logistics chain delivered ammunition with impressive efficiency. Liberty ships moved rounds as deck cargo, each carrying up to 500 shells. And Red Ball Express convoys included specialized reinforced vehicles for the 360-pound projectiles. By April 1945, U.S. forces in Europe had fired 429 rounds of 240 millimeters ammunition while keeping theater reserves above 100,000 rounds, an expenditure and stockpile unmatched by Germany, Japan, or even the Soviet Union, amplifying the weapon's psychological effect. Operating the M1 240mm howitzer demanded exceptional teamwork and endurance. Each 14-man crew functioned as a tightly choreographed team with defined roles. Section Chief NCO, gunner who laid the piece, assistant gunner who operated the breech, numbers 3-8 as ammunition handlers, numbers 9-10 to operate the M2 crane, 11-12 as powder handlers, and 13-14 as vehicle drivers and security, and loading required precise coordination. The 360-pound projectile was lifted by crane. 4 men guided it into the breach, and it was rammed home hydraulically, as up to 8 separate powder bags were loaded behind it. A proficient crew could complete the sequence in about 90 seconds. Private First Class Michael Sullivan, an ammunition handler with the 697th, recalled the physical toll. After 10 rounds, everyone was exhausted and the concussion felt like a blow to the chest. So crews rotated hourly to maintain efficiency. But the knowledge of what their shells did to German bunkers kept morale high. Forward observers who directed 240mm fire held one of the war's most hazardous posts, often positioned with frontline infantry and sometimes beyond friendly lines. They picked targets and adjusted fire with deadly precision. Lieutenant Robert Anderson of the 265th survived 187 days in combat and credited himself with directing the destruction of 47 German bunkers, later describing calling in 240mm as summoning Thor's hammer, identify the bunker, radio the coordinates, and minutes later it vanished. A power both intoxicating and sobering because each shell could kill dozens. Observers carried BC scopes with 20x magnification, M1 plotting boards, CR610 radios, and 48-pound backpack radio units, aerial photos, maps, compasses, and rangefinders, and many bore the psychological weight of seeing at close range the wounded and dead. Nightmares and lasting trauma were commonly reported in post-war interviews. Captured German documents echoed this terror. A November 1944 report from the 7th Army taken at Metz declared that enemy super-heavy artillery represented a new form of warfare, engaging individual bunkers with observed fire of extreme accuracy, producing casualties from single shells that exceeded those from conventional barrages and causing catastrophic morale effects as troops refused to occupy forward positions. The German 19th Army defending the Vosges reported that about 60% of its losses came from artillery, with 240mm fire causing disproportionate casualties despite its relatively limited volume. Defensive emplacements that had sheltered troops for months turned into fatal traps once American observers fixed their positions. Post-war testimony from German veterans repeatedly highlighted the crushing mental effect. Oberst Heinrich Seemann, who led a regiment on the Siegfried Line, recalled in 1962 that conventional artillery could be borne, but those enormous projectiles destroyed morale. When a bunker vanished, you realized nowhere offered safety, and he admitted many of his men preferred suicide to waiting for the next strike. The M1 240mm howitzer formed part of an Allied corps of super-heavy guns that included British and Soviet pieces, yet American industrial output proved decisive. Comparative production figures illustrate the gap. U.S. M1 240mm howitzers, 315 units. British BL 7.2-inch howitzers, 36 units. Soviet 280mm BR-5 mortars, 47 units. German 24mm K3 railway guns, 8 units. The U.S. edge was not only in numbers but in mobility and sustained use. Unlike German and Soviet super-heavy systems that relied on rail or elaborate emplacement, the M1 could be towed by tracked vehicles and set up on any suitable ground. British observers repeatedly praised American super-heavy artillery. Major General Sidney Kirkman, artillery commander of the 30 Corps, wrote that the American 240mm achieved the systematic, rapid reduction of fortified positions that their heavy guns could not, and were largely responsible for the breakthrough at Cassino. As Allied forces pushed into Germany in early 1945, the 240ers continued its destructive role. Every city Hitler declared a fortress was methodically reduced by super-heavy barrages. The siege of Aschaffenburg from March 25 to April 3, 1945, demonstrated the weapon's urban utility. The German 36th Infantry Division had turned the medieval town into a maze of barricades and strongpoints, and the 265th Field Artillery Battalion emplaced 4 howitzers across the river to pick apart defensive positions. The accuracy was startling. Forward observers could thread 240mm rounds through specific buildings while sparing neighboring structures. And such selective demolitions led many German officers to capitulate rather than watch their cities destroyed. The fall of Nuremberg from April 16, 1945 involved 3 240mm battalions, medieval fortifications, reinforced with modern concrete collapsed under bombardment, and the 698th demolished 8 major bunkers in the old city wall during 4 hours of firing on April 19th. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, American 240mm howitzers had played a crucial role in victory. U.S. Army Ordnance final figures recorded total rounds fired in the European theater of operations at 1/18,429. Fortified positions engaged numbered 3,847, of which 3,114 were confirmed destroyed, about 81%, and 489 damaged beyond use, approximately 13%. The average rounds expended per destroyed target was 38. Maximum combat range achieved was 25,255 yards. 23 gun tubes required replacement, and there were no catastrophic weapon failures. The human toll exacted by 240mm fire is harder to pin down. Incomplete German records indicate roughly 15,000, 20,000 casualties directly from 240mm bombardment, with psychological casualties that may have doubled that figure. Combat experience drove continual refinements in how the weapon was used. Early action showed that an 8-hour emplacement time hampered tactical flexibility. By 1945, seasoned crews had cut setup time to under 4 hours through better procedures and tools. Mechanical fuse setters raised sustained rates of fire from 1 round every 3 minutes to 1 every 2 minutes, and improved propellant chemistry extended barrel life from about 500 to roughly 800 rounds between replacements. The most important advance was melding photo reconnaissance with fire planning. By 1945, forward observers received annotated aerial photos with every possible target, gridded and numbered, trimming mission processing from 10 minutes to under 4. Although this account concentrates on Europe, 240mm howitzers saw limited service in the Pacific. 6 guns supported the Philippines campaign, and in February 1945 destroyed Japanese fortifications on Corregidor, where concrete-piercing shells proved effective at sealing cave entrances and causing lethal concussive effects deep in mountain strongholds. Plans had existed to deploy some 100 howitzers for Operation Downfall, the projected invasion of Japan, but surrender rendered those unnecessary. Captured Japanese officers later conceded their defenses had not contemplated American super-heavy artillery. Military historians regard the M1 240mm howitzer as a revolutionary siege weapon whose blend of mobility, accuracy, and destructive force made traditional fortifications obsolete. The U.S. official history argued it gave ground forces a capability formerly limited to naval gunfire or strategic bombing, able to demolish fortifications with surgical precision and to reshape both the physical and psychological landscape of modern warfare. Soviet observers who inspected captured German defenses were notably impressed. Marshal Vasily Chuikov, who had commanded at Stalingrad, examined ruined Siegfried Line bunkers, and commented that the Americans solved the problem of modern fortifications not by mass but by precision, one gun achieving what 100 of theirs could not. The terror induced by 240mm strikes left enduring psychological scars. The German Veterans Association documented high rates of specific phobias. Among survivors, seismophobia, fear of vibrations, in 73% of bunker survivors, claustrophobia in 67%, and phonophobia, fear of loud noises, in 89%. And Dr. Hans Müller, who treated veterans in Munich in the 1950s, described a bunker syndrome of nightmares, panic attacks, and an inability to enter concrete structures, arguing that the sudden, total destruction of supposedly safe positions created distinctive trauma patterns. American veterans bore psychological and physical wounds as well. Forward observers reported recurrent dreams about calling fires. Gun crews suffered lasting hearing loss despite protection, and the memory of the firing concussion, chest compression, and overwhelming noise stayed vivid for decades. The effective use of 240mm howitzers exemplified American industrial strategy, mass-producing precision ordnance, whereas Germany, for example, built a few spectacular machines like the 600mm Karl Gerät mortar or the Schwerer Gustav 800mm railway gun in tiny numbers. The contrast is telling. A German 600mm piece required 24 hours to emplace and could fire roughly one round every 10 minutes, while the American M1 240 mortars produced in quantity could be set up in about 4 hours and sustain a firing rate approaching one round every 2 minutes. This illustrated two different wartime philosophies. Germany chased spectacular wonder weapons that promised decisive technological edges, while the United States prioritized weapons that could be manufactured in volume and relied on reliability and numbers for advantage. The 240mm howitzer program cost about $120 million in 1945 when development, production, and ammunition are included, roughly the price of 40 B-24 bombers or 1/600 Sherman tanks. Yet its strategic payoff, the ability to reduce any fortification quickly, vindicated the expense. The M1 240 Menem's legacy reached beyond World War II. Its success validated the concept of mobile super-heavy artillery and influenced Cold War designs. The Soviets later fielded the 2S4 Tyolpan 240mm self-propelled mortar, in part inspired by American wartime experience. Fire control practices born with the 240mm, the formalized FDC and tight integration of aerial reconnaissance, became routine for later artillery, and modern precision munitions trace conceptual roots to the accurate, observed fire missions of 1944 to 45. Several M1s survive as museum pieces. Fort Sill displays serial number 14, which fired the first combat round at Anzio, and Watervliet Arsenal preserves serial number 1, the proving prototype that showed super-heavy mobile artillery was feasible. The 240mm howitzer accomplished something rare in military history. It rendered a whole class of defensive architecture obsolete. For centuries, fortifications had offered defenders a decisive edge. Reinforced concrete bunkers were the ultimate expression of that belief. In roughly 18 months of combat, the 240mm ended that era. Dwight D. Eisenhower later wrote that the gun allowed Allied forces to crack any defensive position quickly and economically, and that by eliminating fortifications, it saved thousands of lives that costly infantry assaults would otherwise have cost. From the German perspective, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring admitted the same reality. Expensive bunkers and emplacements became death traps against a weapon for which they had no counter. Morale collapsed as troops lost faith in fixed positions. Behind aggregate statistics were the men whose service turned industrial production into battlefield effect. Sergeant David E. Mathisi of the 697th served from Anzio to war's end and took part in reducing over 100 enemy positions. In a 1990 interview, he said the crews knew they had a special capability that removed obstacles, which had stalled whole divisions. But they also knew every shell could kill dozens, necessary work that weighed on them. Lieutenant Harold Saunders of the 272nd directed fire during the Normandy breakout. His forward observer team spent 73 straight days in combat and called in missions that destroyed 31 strongpoints. These crews and observers and thousands like them handled unprecedented destructive power with professional discipline, turning American industrial output into battlefield victories one round at a time. German tactics shifted quickly in response, though no wholly effective countermeasure emerged. By late 1944, German defensive doctrine emphasized dispersion and camouflage rather than permanent fortification. A 7th Army directive in December ordered abandonment of fixed works when American super-heavy artillery was present and urged construction of frequently moved field positions with only conventional overhead protection, warning that bunkers concentrated casualties rather than preventing them. This marked a reversal of the Prussian tradition of elaborate fieldworks honed through World War I and the Eastern Front. Some German expedients, dummy positions heated to simulate occupancy, smoke screens, limited electronic jamming of radios, sometimes bought time, but they could not stop the inevitable. As General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding in the Ardennes, summed up, being outproduced was expected against America, but the precision of their heavy artillery made every defensive position vulnerable. We were not just outgunned, but outclassed. Operating the M1 exacted costs from Americans as well. Crews endured brutal physical strain and widespread hearing loss. Post-war Veterans Administration studies found high rates of significant hearing impairment among 240mm veterans, and repeated concussive firing contributed to chronic neurological problems in some long-serving crewmen. Forward observers bore the brunt of risk in 240-meter units. Of 127 men trained for those battalions, 31 were killed and 43 wounded, a casualty rate of roughly 58%, because their exposed posts and the premium the Germans placed on eliminating them made survival unlikely. Mechanical mishaps, though uncommon, could be deadly. On March 3, 1945, a premature detonation inside a 240-meter bore near Püttlingen killed 5 crewmen, an incident traced to a defective fuse that prompted stricter quality control measures. The logistical tail was enormous. A single 240mm battalion needed about 67 vehicles, including specialized prime movers, cranes, and ammo transports. While mobile, the weapons chewed up roads and required engineer work to keep supply lines open, and fuel needs ran to roughly 2,000 gallons a day when on the move. The M1 240 Müller Howitzer embodied American doctrine at its most effective, concentrated destructive power delivered with pinpoint accuracy and backed by unmatched industrial output. Even if individual German bunkers were technically stronger, American factories could wreck them faster than they could be rebuilt. And that arithmetic of production terrified German commanders more than tactical setbacks. They could counter better leadership with cunning tactics or offset numbers with training. But there was no answer to sustained precision firepower supplied without limit. In that sense, the 240mm became a symbol of American industrial democracy, free labor in Detroit. Pittsburgh and Watervliet turned raw materials into weapons that shattered fortifications erected with forced labor, producing not just military victories, but a moral demonstration that democratic societies could marshal greater material power than dictatorships. The German encounter with these guns was not merely a military defeat, but a psychological reversal. Soldiers who had trusted German engineering, the impregnability of concrete works, and the superiority of prepared defense discovered that American production had undermined their entire doctrine. Numbers alone tell part of the tale. 315 howitzers made, 1/18 of 429 rounds fired, 314 bunkers confirmed destroyed. But the deeper effect was the collapse of faith in fixed defenses. Every ruined emplacement proved American superiority across logistics, production, technology, and organization. The 240mm did more than wreck concrete. It demolished the mental underpinnings of German resistance. Wehrmacht troops learned to fear not just the projectile, but what it represented. Inexhaustible ammunition, surgical fire control, mechanical dependability, and the cold efficiency of American industry. In the shattered Siegfried Line lay not only broken masonry, but the broken pretensions of Nazi military power. The thunder of the 240mm announced that an industrial democracy had the means to make victory inevitable. Men who heard those guns understood their meaning. They had challenged an arsenal of democracy and lost, and the terror lingered long after the pieces fell silent, with veterans spending decades trying to process the trauma of watching supposedly impregnable strongpoints dissolve into clouds of dust. Out of that terror came a lasting transformation, the realization that the era of fixed fortifications was over, and with it any doctrine, based on static defense, and the M1. 240mm Howitzer had spoken in the unmistakable voice of American industry. In modern industrial warfare, no defensive position is invulnerable. No fortification beyond breach, no bunker that cannot become a tomb.